Donald Trump has won the Republican primary in New Hampshire by 11 points, and this is quite an underperformance based on the polling aggregate, but it still highlights the fact that Donald Trump is by far and away the leading candidate in the Republican primary, as we've known for quite a long time, and he always was sort of the built-in frontrunner for this entire process. He is still the face of the Republican Party. So, of course, in today's video, we're going to talk about what the potential path is for Nikki Haley, if there is one, and spoiler, there probably isn't, and what's going to happen in the Republican primary going forward, because by all intents and purposes, it seems like the Republican primary is over. But of course, there is a caveat, and we're going to talk about it as we go on throughout this video. But of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So Nikki Haley did overperform expectations. If we take a look at the polling average for New Hampshire, Donald Trump was expected to win the state by anywhere from 17 to 20 points. And he ultimately, as of right now, with 90% of the vote in, has won New Hampshire by 11. So that's still double digits, and he still won the state overall. He has underperformed expectations, but it still cements him as the leader of the Republican Party overall. And that's something that's really not been in dispute since Donald Trump came on the scene in 2015, 2016, and won the GOP primary back then 8 years ago. So he's still the face of the GOP, despite the fact that there are a sizable minority of Republicans that want that to change. Time and time again, as we actually have real election results, Republican voters affirm their support of Trump every single time. And going forward to Nevada, South Carolina, Donald Trump is by far and away the leader in those states. So it really does beg the question as to why Nikki Haley is still in the race. It's probably a bit of ego, probably a bit of donor money as well. But realistically, this primary is over, with the one caveat being Donald Trump's legal woes and his indictments, which does make the primary a bit more uncertain. But if that wasn't in the mix, Donald Trump would be the presumptive nominee of the GOP, because looking ahead at all of the other states, Donald Trump is leading those states 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 points. And, no other candidate comes even close. Now, the one thing New Hampshire did do, and I guess Iowa did this as well, is it basically made this a two-person race between Trump and Haley. Now that DeSantis has dropped out the other day, that's really the only viable alternative to Donald Trump. And in the Republican primary in New Hampshire, you did see a sizable amount of independents and even a couple Democrats vote in the primary, as we're going to take a look at the exit polls in just a minute. But going forward, especially with states with closed primaries, you're really going to see the picture of the Republican electorate as a whole, which is about 75% of the electorate still supports Donald Trump, but you do have a quarter of the Republican base that opposes Donald Trump, will not support Donald Trump in a primary, and might not support Donald Trump in a general. And there have been clips on CNN, MSNBC, and other news outlets where you have reporters interviewing Haley supporters in New Hampshire and Iowa who say that they won't back Donald Trump in a general election and will actually back Biden. So the real question is, what kind of voters are those? Some of them voted for Biden in 2020. I suspect most of them did, but there is a sizable minority who voted for Trump both in 2016 and 2020, and their views on him have soured a lot. And that really highlights the Nikki Haley voter overall. The affluent, white, suburban, college-educated voter, usually on the older side, probably older than 45, that is sort of a right-leaning independent, maybe an old guard Republican, maybe voted for Joe Biden in 2020, but is still open to supporting some Republican candidates who aren't Donald Trump. And again, there's some parts of the country where you'll see a lot of these voters concentrated. Atlanta is a big example, Arizona, Maricopa County, really in the suburbs, the old guard Sunbelt Republican suburbs that have really grown a lot over the past 20 years, have become very affluent and have attracted a lot of transplants. That's where you see a lot of these old guard Republicans sort of switch their allegiance over time, as they've really soured on the GOP since it's effectively the party of Trump. And the 2024 primaries just cement that as a matter of fact. Now, there have been some general election polls coming out now that have Joe Biden up pretty considerably. They are the outlier in the polls, but I've always said polls 10 months out from the general election really don't mean much. But if there is a sizable shift over time, it could point to some things. But, Pennsylvania, I think, was the poll where Donald Trump was down by 8 percentage points. And for some reason, Dave McCormick was only down by 3 against Bob Casey Jr., which is really shocking because, you'd expect Bob Casey to run ahead of Joe Biden. And I still think that's likely the case. But, if that poll highlights anything, It's that the electorate's starting to realize that the choice is really going to be between Biden and Trump again. It's not going to be Biden versus some other candidate, whether that's Haley or DeSantis or somebody else. It's going to be Biden versus Trump, unless Donald Trump is thrown in prison and somehow withdraws from the race, which is always a possibility. I think it's pretty slim at this point. The other, obviously, curveball is health. Donald Trump is 77. As you get more advanced in age, and it could happen to Biden too. You could have serious health complications that could throw you out of the race. So there's a number of wild cards in 2024, and we still have 10 months to go. But looking at these exit polls, they do paint a very interesting picture of the Republican electorate. Now, I will say only about half the New Hampshire electorate was Republican, but you have to keep in mind that the majority of New Hampshire voters, or at least a large plurality, are independents in general. So New Hampshire does have open primaries, which means independents and Republicans can vote, and I suspect a fair amount of these independents do vote for Republicans. I guarantee you the vast majority of them probably voted for Kristi in 2022 and in 2020. But 51% of the electorate was Republican, and that electorate went 74-25 to Donald Trump, which is where I got that number from earlier. You have about a quarter of the Republican base that is anti-Trump, is opposed to Trump. Now, that's probably more pronounced in more liberal states like New Hampshire. Obviously, when you go to South Carolina, Alabama, traditionally more safe red states, that number is going to be a lot smaller, but there still is a contingent of more moderate or even some very conservative evangelical Republicans that just don't support Donald Trump anymore and will not vote for him in a primary. And of course, their votes in the general, I think, are really up in the air. Now, when you go to independents, Haley by far and away wins that demographic. She wins it by 22 points. And again, that's kind of an odd number because these independents are probably disproportionately right-leaning. I don't think they necessarily represent independents in New Hampshire as a whole, because I think some people have taken this data to mean that Haley would do exceptionally well with independents. And while that very well could be the case, I don't necessarily think that's true in the state of New Hampshire because this is a Republican primary for the most part. You obviously had independents vote in the Democratic primary as well, but it was not nearly as contested as the Republican primary. Then, of course, you have 6% of the electorate in the primary that are Democrats, and they go 88% to 5 for Nikki Haley, which goes to show you that these Democrats in New Hampshire would feel much safer with Nikki Haley as the Republican nominee than Donald Trump. But I think the motive for a lot of these voters probably was, if Biden was to lose to a Republican, they'd rather it be Nikki Haley than Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is obviously very hated by the Democratic base as a whole. Now, another interesting fact about this primary, it's disproportionately male. That could also be because Republicans are disproportionately male, 52-48. In almost every election, you see females usually outnumber males percentage-wise. Urban and suburban, Donald Trump actually does the best in suburban counties, interestingly enough, although that's 70% of the state. And I really don't know what they consider suburban in New Hampshire. 54-46 in rural areas, and then obviously no shock in urban areas. Donald Trump has the least support. Now, if we scroll down a little bit more, evangelicals still strongly favor Donald Trump, 70-28. Now, New Hampshire's not really a massive evangelical state. Only 20% of the Republican primary electorate is evangelical, so the actual number is a lot lower than that. And of course, the non-evangelical goes to Trump, 52-47. Now, something I didn't bring up before, when we go to age, older voters tend to be more supportive of Nikki Haley, 51-47 for Trump, versus younger voters, 60-36. So you see an age divide. Nikki Haley does better with older voters, as we pointed out earlier. Donald Trump does better with younger voters, so on and so forth. And I think what's interesting here also when we go down is educational attainment and the massive divide between non-college educated and college educated Americans or voters in New Hampshire. College graduates go 56-41 for Haley, so 15-point margin for Nikki Haley, as opposed to non-college graduates, 66-32 for Donald Trump. And this is something I think you'll see echoed in every state across the country. College-educated Republicans tend to be more cautious, tend to support Republicans more like Nikki Haley, and tend to be very viscerally opposed to a candidate like Donald Trump, who really doesn't have much in common with them. Somebody like Nikki Haley, a more polished, well-spoken candidate, just flies over a lot more well. And also Nikki Haley seems a lot more stable and responsible to these voters, as opposed to somebody like Donald Trump, who has a perception of just shooting from the hip and saying exactly what comes to his mind without thinking about it. As we go further, there's some other interesting questions on here as well. Two more questions at the bottom here, and then I'll wrap up this sort of exit poll analysis. But you have, are you part of the MAGA movement? 62% of New Hampshire Republican primary voters say no even 33% of which voted for Trump say they're not part of the MAGA movement. And then, of course, obviously, 93% of those are going to say yes, those are Trump voters. And then, of course, we can go to income as well. This is really sort of the same as sort of the educational divide as well. 100,000 or more, again, if you're college educated, you're more likely to make more money. 51% of those backed Haley, 47% of those backed Trump. And interestingly enough, the 100,000 a year or more is the largest segment of the Republican primary electorate. And then, unsurprisingly, less than 50,000 a year, 66% for Trump, 32% for Nikki Haley. So this exit poll really just highlights where the Republican Party is right now and just the massive divide on educational, income levels, ideological questions, so on and so forth. And of course, as we go on through 2024, again, I really wonder if Haley's going to stay in through the convention in the hopes that Donald Trump is thrown in jail. That's really what I think her logic would be at this point. She's also probably just waiting for her money to dry up, because eventually the donor money is going to dry up if she doesn't really see substantial results. She's obviously trying to get momentum here because she did overperform the polls, but she still didn't win New Hampshire. Had Nikki Haley won New Hampshire, I think it would be a slightly different story. But even in South Carolina, she's trailing in the polls, and every other state in the primary. So I really don't think Nikki Haley can be the nominee by winning the majority of delegates through conventional means. I think the only way she becomes the nominee is if Donald Trump is out of the picture and she stays in the race, and therefore she becomes the nominee. I think that might be the Hail Mary that she's banking on. But in all conventional terms, there really is no path for Nikki Haley in the primary. And essentially, the electoral primary of the Republican Party is over as of yesterday. It was really over after Iowa, but New Hampshire sort of solidified that, because had Haley pulled an upset in New Hampshire, could have had a different story. But I think the primary is effectively over, and Donald Trump, unless something happens, will be the Republican nominee against Joe Biden. Something that really shouldn't shock people in the audience or just voters in general, because that's the way this has really been trending throughout the entirety of the election season. Even where there were bumps in the road after the midterms and after the indictments, Donald Trump always managed to weather the storm. And, the real question is, can he weather the storm of the general election? And if 2020 is any indicator, he won't. But obviously there are things that are different than 2020, but there are also many things that are different than 2016. I think many people erroneously compare this election to 2016 when there really is no comparison. That was 8 years ago, before you had mail-in voting, much higher turnout among Democrats, before you had the falling away among college-educated voters in mass from the Republican Party. So there's many factors we're going to look at all throughout the next 10 months. So of course, stay tuned for that. Like this video down below if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.